Good morning. Yes, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. The first witness this morning is Detective Senior Sergeant Moon. Well, just if he could be called and brought into the virtual courtroom, and then if I can invite the court officer just to do an audio-visual sound check before he's sworn in.
Thank you.
Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, court officer.
Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, can you hear Lidcombe? Detective Senior Sergeant Moon.
I can mute.
Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, can you hear Lidcombe?
Are we able to contact him just to see if he can check his microphone? I wonder if, while we're waiting, we could perhaps go through what's going to happen today.
Certainly, Your Honour.
Mr. Castleton.
The hearing plan for today is firstly Detective Senior Sergeant Gregory Moon. At the end of Detective Moon's evidence, I'll foreshadow to Your Honour submissions that will be formally made as part of the Stage 2 aspect of Your Honour's inquiries into the 2019-2020 bushfire season. At the conclusion of that, I'll invite my learned junior, Ms Stevens, to open the inquest into the death of Colin Burns. There'll be two witnesses called in relation to that inquest, Mr Thompson, who was a neighbour of Mr Burns, and also Deborah Dance, also a neighbour of Mr Burns, and perhaps a family statement in relation to Mr Burns.
Okay. I can't hear the court at all, no. I've got, everything's on. No, I'm down in Wollongong.
Okay.
Perhaps
wait a minute.
take a short adjournment.
We'll just take a short adjournment while we work out
Now.
what's happening with Mr Moon.
Silence, please, I'll stand. All right, Scott has resumed.
I think we have Detective Senior Sergeant Moon now.
Yes, Your Honour.
Yes.
Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The oath's fine.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Mr Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. Detective, would you please state your full name?
It's Gregory John Moon.
And are you a Detective Senior Sergeant within New South Wales Police?
Yes, that's correct.
And have you provided a statement in relation to the cause and origin of the Badger Forest Road fire?
That's correct, yes.
And that statement is dated, is it not, the 27th of October 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you have a copy of that statement with you this morning?
Yes, I do.
Can I ask you firstly to set out in general terms your experience and qualifications in relation to the investigation of fire, and in particular bushfire or wildlife fire?
Yes, I commenced my duties in the crime scene section back in 1995. I undertook a wildfire course back in mid-1997. I've conducted a number of further training areas, including a diploma in forensic investigation that involved 2 different fire courses. I've also obtained statements through CIT for wildfire and structural fire course. I've undertaken training in structural fire course and a senior structural fire course through Canberra Institute of Technology and also the New South Wales Police Forensic Services Group. During my time, I've, as a conservative estimate, been direct interpretation of at least 50 wildfires. I've attended over 1,000 house fires related to wildfires and used indicators to assist in the fire spread and the impingement of fire on those premises. And I've attended 300-400 structural fire courses for the determination, cause and origin of those fires.
Thank you, Detective. Could you outline, please, how you came to be involved in the investigation to the Badger Forest Road fire?
Yes, during the 2019-2020 bushfire period, there were a large number of bushfires down the far south coast of New South Wales. I was charged with looking after all the fires down in the far south coast, which was in area encompassing Bega, LGAs. There were further areas at Bateman's Bay and Shellhaven, which other officers were involved. During this time, there were a number of bushfires that were recorded in that area, particularly the Bega local area government area, and I was tasked with the cause and origin of those fires, including the Badger Forest Fire.
And as part of your investigation, did you undertake a site inspection of the area where it was assumed the fire may have originated from?
Yes, that's correct.
And did you undertake that site inspection on the 9th of January 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
What led you to that particular area, which was, as I understand your statement, near the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road? What was it that led you to that location as a potential area of origin?
Data that was made available to us from a number of sources. Back on the afternoon of the 9th, or into the evening of the 9th, a local resident noticed a red glow that was in that vicinity. He's gone to investigate and has come across the fire at the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road. He's called that through to 000, and subsequent attendance of fire brigade to that location was then recorded through a process that we have within New South Wales Police, and I was tasked with the cause and origin of that fire.
You referred a moment ago to the 9th. Did you mean to say the 27th of December?
The 9th was the date that I attended the scene. Sorry, yes. The fire did occur on the 27th of December 2019.
Now, in terms of your statement, if I can just ask you, please, to describe the terrain or the topography in that area near to the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road, please.
Yes. So the area was a previous logging area that was logged by the Forestry Commission. A staging area was located off the southwestern corner of the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Road. That area was relatively flat and encompassed an area of approximately, I think it was about 200 metres, prior to the terrain dropping dramatically downwards. And I believe it dropped for approximately 100 metres over a period of about 550 metres. So it was a very steep area on the northeast corner of that intersection, or that area of logging coupe.
And from your investigations, were you able to discern what the fuel loads were like prior to the 27th of December 2019 or not?
The fuel loads were, in that particular area, had been altered due to the logging process a number of months earlier. So therefore, a number of the larger trees had been taken away for the process of logging. A large amount of debris from those trees in the harvesting process was located in and around that area, and a lot of those debris were pushed into piles. On the opposite side of Badger Forest Road, the area was heavily vegetated with eucalyptus plants and a lot of underlining growth throughout the lower part, and that was the same on the southern side of Churros Falls Road.
Thank you, Detective. And in terms of the weather conditions leading up to the 27th of December 2019, from your investigations, how would you describe the weather conditions in that period of time prior to the 27th of December?
Well, we were in a large period of drought. There'd been minimal rain to virtually no rain in the area. Temperatures were hot, and there were a lot of times where heavy winds were recorded through those areas. So therefore, a lot of the fuel load would be extremely dry and would be enabled to be ignited really relatively easily.
Thank you. Detective, as part of your investigation, did you obtain lightning strike data from an organisation given the acronym GPATS?
Yes, that's correct.
And could I ask you to go to page 255 of your statement, and I'll have a chart brought up, which is chart number 3, as part of your statement. And I'll just see if that can be magnified for the benefit of others. Were you able to identify that there were a number of lightning strikes in the area near towards the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road in the afternoon of the 27th of December 2019?
Yes, that's correct. A storm did move through that area for a period of about 4 hours. This area of Badger Forest Road was particularly impacted in between the time between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. What we're looking at on that chart is the GPS references of the lightning strikes that were located within the area.
Detective, as I understand your expert opinion, you're of the view that it's most probable that the cause of this particular fire was by lightning strike at about 3:37 p.m. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
And as we see in that chart, chart 3, image 1, there are a number of lightning strikes recorded at 3:37 p.m. Of those 3, which in your opinion is the most likely lightning strike that was the cause of this particular fire?
It's the lightning strike in the middle of the three that are referenced 337.
And why did you form that conclusion?
So when you look at the distance at that point to the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road, data that is given by that company have an accuracy rate, they would say, of 200 metres. So when we project a 200 metre radius around those locations, the one in the middle is the only one that falls within the initial area where the fire was reported.
And do we see that in the second image as part of chart 3?
Yes, that's correct. So when we look at the closer image of the intersection there, the red hashed area indicates the potential area where the first fire was observed by witnesses and the first attending fire brigade personnel. The blue circle is a 200 metre radius from the centre of that lightning strike, marked as 3:37 p.m.
Now, if you go to the next chart, which is chart 3.1 on page 256, what features were you able to identify when you conducted your site inspection that led you to the more likely opinion that the cause was by lightning strike in that general area that we see in those images that have just been displayed?
If you scroll across to the aerial photograph, might be easier. So when we look at that area there, it is an estimate of the lightning strike data as well as the 200 metre radius. We just got to be mindful that the angle that the photo is taken makes it difficult to get a true representation of the 200 metre radius. Further, you can see when you look towards the top left corner of the image, you can see the big ridge line and the dramatic drop that goes down into the valley below. So one of the main points I put towards this as being somewhere where the area origin was, at the time of this lightning strike, prevailing winds were easterly at a moderate to strong intensity, and those winds were in play for about 6 hours before there was a wind change. So therefore,
Just pausing there.
Sorry
to cut you off, Detective. Does the image that's on the screen now adequately describe those prevailing easterly winds that you mentioned a moment ago in your evidence?
Yes, that's correct. So again, we're looking at the hashed areas of the lightning strikes and first recorded fire area. The white arrow on the right side of the photograph indicates the direction of the wind for a period of 5 hours. So then the green arrows represent the effects terrain will have on the wind. So in a true sense, when wind blows and hits a barrier, that barrier is going to move the wind in a certain direction. So therefore, the wind coming up that valley and hitting that big slope will change the wind direction to potentially a northerly or southeast direction, and even towards the southwest. What we know is that there was no fire impingement on the southern side of Churros Falls Road. So taking into account that, the area of burning is more consistent with over the period of 4 to 5 hours, starting in that area and moving towards the Badger Forest Road point.
And just so that Her Honour can understand this more easily, in that image that's presently displayed, image 1 of chart 4, one sees some unsealed roads. Is the Badger Forest Road the road in the top left-hand corner that runs
Yes, that's
from the
correct. Yes,
top
that's
of the image?
correct.
And then the other road that has some printing on it is the Churros Falls Road, which travels down to the bottom edge of that image.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned that the fire was called in by a witness to it on the evening of the 27th of December 2019. Was that at around about 9:30 or thereabouts that
That's
000
correct, yeah.
call was made?
Yes, that's correct.
If we go then to the next image on the right of chart 4, was there a wind shift or change from about 8 p.m. or thereabouts on that same evening, the 27th of December?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. The wind shifted from the north and the northeast, abated a little bit to wind speeds between 11 and 28 kilometres an hour. Now, saying that, that wind data has been taken from the Cooma airport, which was located, I believe, about 35 kilometres to the southwest.
And as a result of that wind shift, what effects, if any, did that have on this particular fire's behaviour in that period between 8 p.m. and 8:30 a.m. between the 27th and the 28th of December 2019?
If we make the assumption that the fire started somewhere near that lightning strike in the initial stages, and it has then burnt in a front towards the northern aspect of it, that wind shift will then have a transitional phase change where one of the flank on the left side would then potentially become part of the front, therefore changing direction of that fire more towards the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road.
And that transition, does that cause any limitations for a fire investigator on the ground trying to read particular macro or micro fire indicators?
Yes, it can. If you can determine the transition point, and if the new front assists, it does move towards a fresh fuel, it isn't as problematic. However, the main problems are when fires start burning back on themselves and start altering the initial indicators found from the initial part of the fire.
And from your investigation, did this fire at any point back onto itself?
Yes, there was evidence that there were spot fires about 2 to 3 days later that were located to the northwest in the area on the western side of Badger Forest Road. And then on the fire activity increased on the 30th, and that fire front then burnt back through this original area.
And does that then throw up for an investigator such as yourself potential conflicting fire indicators?
Yes, that's the limitations that then become far greater, as we can't determine if the fire indicators and macro and micro indicators were part of the first initial fire or part of the second fire.
Thank you. I may return to that topic in a moment. I might then ask you, please, Detective Moon, to go to your next chart, chart number 5, on page 258. And if we could scroll down, please, to the fire spread map for the 28th of December at 4:02 p.m. Detective Moon, did you also, as part of your investigation, undertake an aerial inspection of the fireground?
Yes, I did.
And from your aerial inspection, together with what you have obtained through eyewitness accounts, does the fire spread that one sees in the image before you now, which is the 28th of December 2019 4:02 p.m. image, does that generally accord with your understanding of how this fire progressed in its early stages?
I can't rely on the aerial images, as the aerial images were taken on the 24th of January. There were a number of attempts to get up and take aerials in earlier instances, but the fire conditions, weather, made this impossible. So the actual aerial images don't assist greatly in the fire spread, as surrounding areas of this particular fire progression map were also burnt. So therefore, we will need to put more emphasis on this particular map and subsequent maps for fire spread.
Thank you. Did the spread from the various maps that you had access to suggest that this fire emanated in the typical U-shape or V-shape that fire behaves in?
Yes, it does. To a point, if we look at the previous map, the one above it, as we can see there, the spread of the map is, the fire spread is more circular, and that's more probably the case to the transition zones that have occurred on that first night. Therefore, as I believe, there were at least 3 transition zones that occurred on that first night. We had the winds that came from the east, we had the winds that came from the northeast, and then we had winds that came from the northwest. So therefore, we've had transition zones where the fire has potentially burnt back over itself. It's more circular. When we look at the fire spread on the map below, we then see that the spread of the fire has then gone into a more traditional U shape, and that is as a result of consistent winds blowing that direction, as well as needing to look at the terrain, as if you have valleys and gullies, they can also project the fires in a certain direction.
Detective, thank you. You've been able to express an opinion in relation to general area of origin. Are you able to express an opinion as to a specific or actual point of origin in relation to the Badger Forest Road fire? Or
yeah, not in this particular case. I lean more towards somewhere within that 200-metre zone where the lightning data was that we previously talked about, and if anything on that, I would lean more towards the bottom left side of that circle due to the wind and the terrain effects.
And just so we're clear, the circle that you're referring to is the circle that one sees on chart 4 in the blue shading?
Yes, that's correct. So if we talk in terms of a clock, it would be somewhere near that point of the lightning strike, and on the side that is 1 hour, 2, 3, 4 o'clock area, maybe even potentially down to a 5 o'clock area on the clock if we looked at segments.
Yes. And why is it that it was too difficult to express an opinion in relation to a specific or actual point of origin in circumstances where you've drawn the conclusion that the most likely cause of this particular fire was lightning strike?
In this particular case, there were a lot of limitations. We've touched on a number of already. being that a second fire has burnt through this area. In particular, this was a logging area previously completed only a number of months earlier. There had been a large amount of clearing, so tractor areas had been moved in there, man-made tracks to remove the logs. And also one of the biggest limitations in identifying areas was also that they brought in heavy machinery the following day, I believe, to assist in attempting to make a further fire break. So I don't know at what areas that they have disturbed evidence, and we have a big period, nearly of 2 weeks, between the time of the fire and my investigation.
And you've identified some of those limitations, I think, at page 243 of Exhibit 2A, at paragraph 50 of your statement. That's so?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in terms of other possible causes of this particular fire, were you able to exclude other potential causes?
Yes, when we do a cause determination, we look at a number of different factors that may bring towards a cause of a fire. In this particular case, we've talked about lightning. We have lightning in the area. We have lightning in the area a number of hours before the fire was first seen, and in the current conditions of the area, it was, it could be likely that a lightning strike would start a fire. We also look at a lot of different areas, including deliberate, as in an arson, someone deliberately lights this fire. In this particular case, I believe it's unlikely due to the remoteness. However, you can't rule that out because it is located on an area that has access by roads. Other deliberate acts such as vehicle fires have been ruled out. There were no burnt vehicles in the area. Other accidental things like cigarette butts, again, it's probably unlikely, but again, any evidence of a cigarette butt there is likely to be consumed, considering we had 2 fires move through that area. There's a number of other ones we look at for unintentional fires, such as power lines, motor vehicle accidents, hazard reductions. There was no hazard reduction in the area at the time. Machinery is one that we look at, and that's one that we did look at it a little bit further in this case, as there was a log that showed recent evidence of a chainsaw effects, in that the tree had been slabbed to remove a piece of timber from that. However, a lot of the sawdust around that showed fire damage or fire effects, which were coming from all directions. So there was no direct path away from that area.
Just so I'm clear, you were able to exclude the use of that chainsaw on those logs?
Look, again, I won't use the terminology of excluding. I think it's highly unlikely that it was, but as I said, because a number of our indicators were disturbed prior to our investigation, or my investigation, in conjunction with the RFS investigators.
You formed the view, did you not, though, that it's likely that the fire started due to lightning strike, having regard to other competing potential causes, correct?
Yes, that's correct. That is the most likely scenario based on all the data available to me to make that opinion.
Yes. Thank you, Detective. That's my examination. There may be some other questions from other parties, so please bear with us for a moment. Thank you.
Mr. Free.
Thank you, Your Honour. No questions from us.
Thank you. Mr. Glascott.
Thank you, Your Honour, and no questions from me.
Thank you. Thank you, Detective. You're excused.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Castellan.
Your Honour, that concludes the evidence in relation to Your Honour's inquiry into the cause and origin of the Badger Forest Road fire and the Kundella fire. Your Honour now has the benefit of the documentary material contained within Exhibit 2A and the oral testimony from Detective Senior Constable Glenn Bradley, New South Wales RFS Fire Investigator Ian Cook, New South Wales RFS Fire Investigator Darren Howell, and Detective Senior Sergeant Gregory Moon. At a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, those assisting Your Honour will formally address Your Honour on the cause and origin of the Badger Forest Road fire and the Kundella fire. In that regard, I can foreshadow to Your Honour and to my learned friends now that a formal submission is likely to be made that the origin of the Badger Forest Road fire was near the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Churros Falls Road in Count Agony, and the cause of the fire was a lightning strike on the 27th of December 2019 at approximately 3:37 p.m. Your Honour, in relation to the Kundella fire, I can again foreshadow to Your Honour and to my learned friends that a formal submission is likely to be made that the origin of the Kundella fire was in the Dua National Park near the intersection of the Kundella and Wham Bam fire trails, and the cause of the fire was a lightning strike on the 28th of December 2019 at approximately 7:20 a.m. Your Honour, that's all I wish to say at this point in time in relation to those two fires. Could I invite Your Honour to stand those two fire inquiries over generally to the commencement of Your Honour's inquiries as part of the Stage 2 aspect of Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, which is scheduled to commence on the 5th of September 2022.
Yes, I will do that now. Generally stood over to that Stage 2.
May it please Your Honour, if it's convenient to Your Honour, could we take the morning adjournment now in order to contact particular witnesses in relation to the inquest into the death of Colin Burns?
We'll adjourn now and resume at 11:15.
May it please Your Honour.
Please all stand. Coroners Court has resumed.
Yes, Ms Stevens. We will now be commencing the inquest into the death of Colin Burns.
And may it please the court. Your Honour, this is the inquest into the death of Colin Burns. Colin, or Cole as he was known to many of his friends, died after the Badger fire reached his property on the 31st of December 2019. He was 72 years old. Colin was a resident of Ballowra and lived on his property, Gillabilly Farm, of about 1,500 acres. This property had been originally purchased by Colin's parents. Your Honour might be interested to know that he spent much of his childhood together with his brother Bruce and his parents on the south coast. Later in life, both Cole and Bruce bought properties on adjoining land. Bruce died many years ago and Colin took over his property. He had a long-time partner, Estrella or Threlly Kavakuman. She lives in Sydney and, Your Honour, she's present today. Your Honour, I can hear some feedback. Perhaps.
I just would ask those listening in, until you're called as a witness, if you wouldn't mind just going on mute. because it makes a bit of noise here in the courtroom. Thank you very much.
Your Honour, I was just at the point where I was telling you that Colin's partner, Threlly Kabakuman, she's present here today virtually, and she's watching the proceedings.
And I welcome you today, Threlly.
Colin lived between Gillett Farm and Sydney at Threlly's house. He was also an active member of the Ballara RFS and had been since the 1980s. In terms of his employment, he worked in the mining industry, but he retired early and spent most of his time on the south coast. Colin's property in Ballara was largely bushland, but contained 3 distinct properties. Threlly told investigating police in her statement, "He's had that farm since he was about 7 years old. It's a hobby farm of his parents. There are 3 houses down there, but he stays in the shack. He doesn't want to live in the house, but if I go and stay with him, we stay in the house. The last time I went down there with him was the first week of November of 2019. Your Honour, we will show the court a map that demonstrates from an aerial perspective that dense bushland. Your Honour can see Ballara Road at the bottom, and that was his property of about 1,500 acres. Your Honour will know from the flyover that you participated in with the New South Wales Police that that property is in very remote and dense bushland. Cole had some cattle, about 60, and Threlly says that the farm is difficult to access by road and surrounded by thick woods. The road is not sealed and access is through Bodella. A turn to the days preceding the fire that impacted the property. Cole had been in Sydney with Threlly over the Christmas period in 2019. He left Sydney in the afternoon of the 27th of December to drive back to the farm. He called her at 2 a.m. that morning to tell her he'd arrived safely. A local friend from his running club was there to meet him. On the 28th of December, which is once the fire had started, he remained at the farm and spoke with Threlly a number of times. He said that fire was about 15 kilometres away, but he'd prepared himself with pumps and with water. From as early as this date, it appears that his plan was to remain on the property and defend it. In the early hours of the morning of the 28th of December, Cole called his old friend and RFS member, Ewan Thompson. Ewan had known Cole for over 50 years. They stayed in telephone contact over the coming days. He will give evidence shortly, Your Honour, before this court. On the 28th or 29th of December, Cole called Threlly again and told her that the power was out and he could only contact her by mobile. Unfortunately, on the 30th of December, the fire encroached onto Cole's property from the west and the first of his 3 cottages was destroyed. At this time, a number of members from the RFS went to his house. Ewan Thompson, who I referred to earlier, Richie Seeley and Rowan Trefold. These 4 men drove to the Badger Forest fire front to assess the fire behaviour. At this stage, that is on the 30th of December, Richie Seeley says that the fire was moving slowly with flames of about 1 metre in height. They all discussed with the neighbouring properties and whether or not they could be defended. Later that day, the RFS dropped Cole back at his property and attended to different duties. The fire condition worsened. The RFS returned and some helped Cole prepare his property. At that stage, there were 2 RFS tankers and 5 RFS personnel. They cleared rubbish and helped with pumping water. One of the members, Peter Knight, says in his statement provided to investigating police that as they sprayed water around the main house, in his words, I could hear the fire roaring up the valley towards us. I turn now to the night of the 30th December. At around 6 p.m, Threlly spoke with Cole for the last time. The RFS worked with him all night. Richie Seal says in his statement that the weather changed and, in his words, we needed to look at saving lives and not properties. In the early hours of the morning, Richie drove back to Cole's house and he was sitting on the porch. Richie advised him to get out and get to the fire shelter. He says that Cole responded and told him that he would stay and protect the property. This is consistent with what Threlly has spoken to police about. She said, Cole is stubborn, but he is very kind and generous and loving. He is sometimes stubborn and wants things his way. He would have wanted to protect his farm. The 3 RFS members stayed through much of the night and continued to help Cole with his preparations. They left at around 3 a.m. and Trevor, one of those RFS officers, says, I knew Colin to be a very strong-willed person and one who was very hard to be dissuaded once he'd made up his mind on a subject. The evidence before the court will likely demonstrate that Cole made a deliberate decision to stay at his property as long as he could. Ewan Thompson will give evidence of the conditions near the property at the time and his conversations with Cole about his fire plan. The court will also hear from Deborah Dance, a neighbour of Cole. She's provided a statement to investigating police. Her family lived at 3070 Ballowra Road in Ballowra, which was the adjoining property. In her statement, Deborah says, we had a big fire tear through our place at around 6 a.m, that is 6 a.m. on the 31st, which destroyed our 2 houses and fences. She will give evidence about her experience on the day, including the timing and the location of the fire, and how she escaped it. On the afternoon of the 31st of December, once the fire had torn through Cole's property, Senior Constable Peter Gillett was rostered on duty at Batemans Bay Police Station, but was working out of Nowra due to the fires. He had been informed by various RFS members of the fact that Colin Burns was missing. He was tasked to commence an investigation into his whereabouts, given the development of the fire in Ballowra the previous night. He was also aware of a report of a burnt-out vehicle near Colin's property. Due to the fire activity, there was widespread radio, electric and mobile phone outages, and these conditions precluded any search and rescue for 24 to 48 hours. The following day, on the 1st of January, Ewan Thompson and another RFS member drove back to Cole's property and located his burnt-out car. They cordoned off the area. The following day, the 2nd of January, Detective Gillett and Detective Inspector Sasha Debnan flew by ADF helicopter from Maria Airport to Ballowra RFS, and they spoke with members of the Dance family about the whereabouts of Colin's ute. These investigating police then drove from the Ballowra RFS shed to a point along Ballowra Road that, according to the material before the court, was about 1.9 kilometres west of the Ballowra Bridge, and it is at that point where they located Cole's ute. This was about 50 kilometres from Vidala. Inspector Debnan examined the ute, which was later confirmed to be Cole's. It had a trailer that was manufactured for use in firefighting. Both these vehicles were extensively damaged by fire. The ute sat on exposed metal rims and there was no glass left in the windows. Colin's ute was positioned against the cutting of the road with the trailer tipped on its side. The road was a narrow, unsealed dirt road. The road ran east-west and the ute was faced in an easterly direction. Investigating police were of the opinion that the trailer rolled over as the ute attempted to negotiate a right-hand curve and that Cole died as a result of the fire impacting the vehicle. Detective Gillett commented in his statement about the conditions when they examined that ute. He says, "The Ballowra Valley is primarily used for cattle grazing, with the majority of the valley being cleared paddocks with sporadic bush with the gently undulating hills. The entire valley had suffered catastrophic bushfire damage, with the ground being mostly ash and most trees being destroyed by fire. In my opinion, the damage to the landscape was consistent with a very hot and fast-moving wildfire." Colin's remains were located in the ute and later positively identified as his. It is likely that the evidence will demonstrate that Cole stayed at his property, as was his plan, until the fire reached the house. It is likely that he realised that he could not defend it or himself, and he made a late decision to evacuate. The evidence will show that he drove down Ballowra Road and in an easterly direction, away from the property in the fire. Due to the extremely difficult conditions and the pace of the fire, he was unable to drive to safety. Your Honour, I call Ewan Thompson.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, can you hear us?
I can.
All right, we'll just get the court officer to swear you in.
Mr. Thompson, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
Yes, fine.
Was that the affirmation, Mr. Thompson?
I said the oath is fine. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay.
we can hear you.
Yeah, the oath will be fine.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Thompson. You'll just hear from Ms. Stevens now.
Sir, can you hear me?
I can.
Will you give your full name to the court?
Ewan Douglas Thompson.
And are you a volunteer with the RFS?
I am.
Mr. Thompson, have you made a statement to police in regard to the death of Colin Burns?
I have.
Can you tell the court how long you have been an RFS volunteer?
Roughly 60 years, 50 odd as captain.
Did you say 50 odd as captain?
I think it's roughly 54 years.
And which brigade were you a captain of?
Ballowra.
And when did you first meet Colin?
Somewhere in the 1980s. I don't remember the exact time, but around about that time.
Did he volunteer in your brigade with you?
He did.
And do you know how long he was a member for?
I don't. The records have been lost, but I believe it was somewhere in the 1990s that he became a member.
Did you say the 1990s?
Yes,
So some considerable time, is it fair to say?
that's right.
Mr. Thompson, I'd like to ask you some questions about the days leading up to the fire that took Cole and his property. And I understand from your statement that you spent time with him on the 30th and the 31st. Is that right?
That's correct.
You say in your statement that he had 3 cottages on his property, 1 to the west and 2 more. Can you explain to the court where each of the cottages was on his property?
The one that first was burnt was at Woyler Creek, which was to the west of what his living area actually is. It was isolated from the other two buildings that he owned.
Yes.
The other two buildings that he was living, or one that he was living in, which was a shack, and there were two other houses or cottages there next to his living quarters, and they were the area that we were trying to protect. It was up on top of a ridge, which made it very difficult to defend.
You say it made it very difficult to defend. Can you explain to the court why that was?
Well, being so high and with timber leading up on all sides, it didn't matter what direction the fire actually came, he was going to be under threat because it was always coming uphill to him.
When did you first arrive on Cole's property on the 30th?
It was around about 9:30 in the morning.
And were you with your brigade at that time?
I was with our deputy fire control group officer. We were going to inspect the fire on the Badger Road.
And did you take Cole with you and went and inspected the fire front?
We did.
And what was your assessment of the fire at that time?
It hadn't moved a great deal down the mountain towards Colin's place from the day before when Colin and I had seen it. But it was at this stage still moving reasonably slow, but it had a very big front.
It had a very big front, you say?
We couldn't see the ends of the front. It was so extended.
Can you estimate in terms of distance for the court?
Looking at maps and what I could see, it seemed to be at least 2 kilometre frontage, but we couldn't see it all because of the smoke.
Was Cole concerned about his properties at that point?
Yes.
What did he say to you about that?
He wanted to know how we were going to defend it, and I tried to explain to him that if we tried to protect his home on Woyler Creek, that we would not be able to do it, as it would cut us off from protecting anyone else in the valley. If the fire actually got past us, we could not get our truck out.
And pausing there, Mr. Thompson, just pausing there, you're talking about the cottage, you said Woyler Creek. Is that W-O-I-L-A Creek?
That's correct. Woyler Creek, we call it.
And is that the property on the west?
That's correct. It was the first property that he lost.
You go, sorry.
It was the first property that he lost.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Just want to interrupt, Mr. Thompson. You cut out a little bit when you would just explain something that was really important. I just wonder if you could repeat that again when Cole asked you what you were going to do to protect his property. Would you just repeat that again? We just had a little bit of trouble hearing it.
I explained to him that because that property was isolated and in amongst a lot of, or the access to it was surrounded by a lot of timber, scrub, that if the fire got to there, we would not be able to protect that property because we could be cut off from protecting the rest of the properties in the valley.
Thank you.
And when in that day did the fire take that property that we're referring to?
I believe it was round about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Were you attending to other duties during the day in addition to assisting Cole with preparing his properties?
Yes, we were very worried about another fire to the south on the southern end of the valley, which was roughly 22 kilometres away. And at that stage, that was the biggest threat.
Sorry, can you just repeat the last part of your evidence, Mr. Thompson?
The fire to the southern end of the valley at that stage on the 30th looked as if it was going to be the greatest threat to the valley.
And after Colin lost that first property, did he change his mind about whether he was going to stay and defend the other two?
He never changed his mind at all. He was always going to stay and defend the rest of his property.
Did you talk to him about that?
Yes, and we explained to him that well, at this stage, I believed the situation had changed from the southern end of the valley to the northern end, that the northern end would then be a bigger worry to us with a nor'wester wind blowing, and the fire could sweep in from the northern end and go right through the southern end. And he still, Cole and Burns still insisted that he would stay there.
Now, in your statement to police, you say that at around 8 p.m. you sent your crew back to the fire shed to have a rest because they were exhausted from the day. Now, what did you do after that point?
I stayed at Colin's place with another member of the brigade.
And who was that?
Trevor Kincaid. And we stayed with Cole and talked to him until well in the night when he went off to have a sleep.
And how long did you and Trevor stay at Cole's property that night?
Until 2:30, when Trevor Kincaid left me to go back after Richard Seeley, the deputy group captain, had notified me that they would have to remove the Dalmini 7 tanker and proceed to Nerragunda as assistance was required there. So at that stage, I stayed for a bit longer because I had to wind up our lines with the hose lines that we had laid out to defend Cole's property.
So, Mr. Thompson, just pausing there, when you say the Dalmine 7 tanker, is that the tanker that's attached to your brigade?
No, they're from a brigade on the coast who had come out earlier on the 30th to lend assistance.
So was that tanker at Cole's property until the early hours of the morning?
It was. Well,
and where did it?
No, could I correct that?
Yes.
That tanker then went back to the Dalmini fire station with their crew. There were 2 of them to have a rest. Also, they'd been out from first thing on the 30th.
And after the tanker left the property and then Trevor left the property, you remained. Were any other RFS officers present at that time?
No.
Can you estimate how long you stayed up there with him?
I believe it. I was there probably for roughly half an hour. By the time I'd wound in the hoses, restacked them, and had a quick look to see where the fire was, I'd say roughly half an hour. 30 to 40 minutes anyway.
So can you just explain that to the court? 30 minutes, you mean the fire was 30 minutes away?
No, I went after winding in the hoses. I drove then in our Balaura tanker to observe how much closer the fire had got to Cole and Burns' buildings.
And what was your assessment at that time?
The fire had changed direction there was a very warm nor'wester blowing, and the fire was sweeping more to the south and had slowed down in the direction towards Colin's buildings.
And how would you describe your level of concern for Colin's property at that time?
I was very concerned, but the fire at that stage seemed to be a bigger threat to the southern or middle section of the Ballara Valley. And I had to make the decision of whether to leave or stay there, and decided that more people were going to be at risk on the southern end of the valley. So I had to say to him, I had to leave.
And when you left, did you go to attend to other properties in the southern end of the valley?
I went back to the fire station, picked up a crew member who was the only one available, and then we headed back towards Colin Burns' property. We were confronted with the fire roughly 5 kilometres from his place, and then we had to defend another property on just near there.
And when you left Colin in the early hours of that morning, in your statement, you've told police that you said to him, if your life is threatened, leave and go to the fire shed. By the fire shed, do you mean at Ballara?
That's correct.
And what did Colin say in response to that?
He just nodded. He didn't say anything. He understood what I was saying.
And after you left the property and when it attended to those other duties, did you end up going back to the Ballara fire shed?
I did, to pick up a crew member.
And when did you next go back the following morning?
Back to where do you mean?
To the fire shed.
I went. I had a call at where we were defending a house. I had a call from the fire shed by UHF radio to say that the fire shed could be coming under threat. So at this stage, I'd called Dalmini 7 to assist me with this fire at a neighbour's place called Mountain Run, owned by Gary Nicholson. I then left him at that house and proceeded back to the fire shed with my crew member, Peter Knight. As I got to the fire shed, I had a call from our deputy group captain, Richard Seeley, who told me there was a house under threat and to get to it quickly on the southern end of the valley. I noticed that the fire was not threatening the fire shed at that stage, which had a lot of people in it who had evacuated from their properties to go there for safety. I then called Dalmini 7 tanker to come back to the fire shed to protect those people at the shed, and I proceeded to the south to try and save a home down there.
And around about what time was that?
I believe I left the house that we were defending around about 4:30, and it would have been possibly 5 o'clock, something like that, when I got the other end of the valley.
So you worked all night?
Yes.
Was there a point in time the following morning that you heard some news about Col?
When I got back to the fire shed after we'd done all we could, it's hard to put times on things because we thought it was midnight when we got back at 8 o'clock at night at least, and it was actually only midday. Everything was so dark we couldn't tell the difference between day and night. But when I got back to the fire shed, Keith Dance and his wife and son were there, and I asked them if they'd heard or seen anything of Col, and that's when they informed me they had found his vehicle.
And you mentioned Keith Dance and his wife. Is that Deborah Dance?
That's correct.
And did they have a property next to Colin's property up in the valley?
It was one of the properties that adjoined Colin Burns.
And when you've heard that information, what did you do with it?
I spoke to Richard Seeley, the Deputy Group Captain. He informed Fire Control Centre in Maria.
And was there a point where you and another member got in your car and drove up back Ballowra Road to look for the ute?
The next morning we did, first thing. We weren't able to gain access on the night, on the day of the 31st because of the danger, and so many trees were falling. It was nearly impossible to access any part of away from the fire shed.
And when you were able to access that area, did you locate Colin's ute on Ballowra Road?
I did.
Can you estimate about how far the ute was from Col's property?
Roughly between 3 and 3.5 kilometres. That's by road.
There's evidence before the court, Mr. Thompson, that his ute had a trailer attached and the trailer had tipped over. Was that what you saw?
That's correct.
And what was your assessment about what had happened?
I believe that he was blinded by smoke and possibly a very fierce burst of fire. Could not see the road, ran up the bank, and the vehicle had come back onto the road, was still on its wheels, but the trailer had tipped over on its side.
And was the ute and the trailer damaged by fire?
The ute was completely burnt out. The trailer had some damage to it. It still contained water in the trailer, in the tanks.
And did you cordon off the area and then report what you'd seen to the RFS and the police?
We cordoned it off, and Richard Seeley notified Fire Control of what we had done.
Can you tell the court what became of Col's other two properties?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Can you tell the court what became of Col's other two properties?
When we returned to have a look what had happened, everything was completely burnt except for a pile of steel he had there. There was no buildings left.
And given your experience, Mr. Thompson, over 60 years of working with the RFS, can you give the court some indication about how the fire behaved on that morning?
I had never seen a fire behave that way. We had never had to fight a fire in the early hours of the morning. Usually fires mid-morning, late afternoon when they really get going. This one took off, really became extreme round about that probably 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, and it became fast moving towards the south. But I'd never fought a fire on such a big front before.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Your Honour, that's the evidence of this witness.
Mr. Thompson, I'll just ask if there are any other questions for you. Just one moment. Mr. Free.
I can just bear with me a moment. I'm just waiting for a message from my instructors.
Certainly.
Sorry, Your Honour. Just check with Glascott and come back to me. I'm sorry for the delay.
Mr. Glascott.
I have no questions. Thank you, Your Honour.
Just wait one moment, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'm sorry about this. That's it, Your Honour. I can confirm no questions from our side.
I'm sorry, Mr. Freed. No
I'm sorry,
question.
Your Honour. Confirming no questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for giving your evidence today and making yourself available. I know it must have been difficult to go through that again, so thank you. You're excused.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. I call the other witness in these proceedings, Deborah Dance.
Ms. Dance, are you there? Can you hear us and see us? Ms. Dance, are you there? Just check if you have your microphone on, if you are there.
We may have some technical problems, Your Honour.
I think. Ms. Dance, are you, I think you're available now, is that right?
That is correct.
Oh, thank you very much. The court officer will now just ask if you'll take the oath or the affirmation.
Okay, I'm happy to do either. Affirmation will be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you, Ms. Dance. You'll now hear from Ms. Stevens.
Ms. Dance, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you see me?
I can, yes.
We can't see you. I don't know if you have your video turned on.
I can try. How's that?
Can't see you yet.
No,
oh, there you are.
Sorry.
We can see you now.
We can see you now.
Okay.
Can you still see us?
Sure. Yes, I can.
Will you give your full name to the court, please?
My name's Deborah Pauline Dance.
And have you provided a statement to police in regard to the death of Colin Burns?
Yes, I did.
And you gave that statement in January of 2020, is that right?
Yes, on the 2nd. Yes.
Ms. Dance, I'd like to ask you some questions about the fire that went through the valley on the 30th and the 31st of December. I understand It's very distressing because you lived in that valley, is that right?
Yes, I do.
Can you explain to the court the size of your property at the time?
The size of our property at the time was 2,600 and something acres.
And was the entrance onto your property from Ballowra Road?
Yes, it is.
And was the entrance to Colin Burns's property also from Ballowra Road?
Yes.
And he was a neighbour of yours, is that right?
Yes, he was probably one of our main neighbour, except for national parks, on our most western property. We have two properties, they split by another property.
And how long did you know Colin for?
I met Colin in 1975.
For a long time?
A long time.
Can you describe the bushland in Colin's property and also the land in yours?
The bush on Gillett was very thick, had been cleared and then let regrow back a couple of times, I believe. And yeah, just, every now and again he'd clear a little piece here and there, but mainly it was just a bush block. And our property is probably 2/3 cleared.
I want to ask you some questions about the night of the 30th and the morning of the 31st of December.
Yes.
Now, on that night, who was at your property?
On that night, there was myself, my husband, Keith, my son Benjamin, and my son-in-law James.
And you were well aware of the fire that had ignited some days before in your area?
Yes, very much aware of it.
And at that time, did you have what I'll refer to as a fire plan or a procedure about what you would do in case the fire came towards you?
Yes, we did. We had what we felt was a fairly safe plan. We had, plan A and plan B. Plan A.
Can you tell the court, tell the court about plan A and plan B?
Well, plan A was to make sure everything was clear. We had tractors in place. We had just three tractors and a bulldozer. We had cleared all around the house. We had ploughed ground around the house and cleared all rubbish away. And we had water, not enough water probably, but, because it was drought, we had what we could. And we felt that we were in a pretty good position to fight a fire. We weren't expecting what came, obviously. And plan B was to, if the fire should overrun us and take over the house, was to move out onto the paddocks where it had burnt and just move onto the burnt ground. And which is exactly what happened in the end.
And had you experienced bushfires on that property in the decades you'd lived on it?
Nothing that was, yes, I have. Some of them were a little threatening, but really nothing like this one. And yeah, so no, nothing like what we actually had. Smaller bushfires, yes.
And can you give us an indication in terms of time about when you became quite concerned about the fire on that morning?
Well, on the 30th, we could see the fire had come through the western end, through the back end of Col Burns's property. We saw the smoke from the house go up, and I realised that the house had burnt down. Then we sat and watched we have a very, very clear view from our house of
I'll just pause you there.
Yeah.
Just pause you there. I'm having a little difficulty hearing you. Can you just repeat those last sentences and maybe a little closer to the microphone?
Okay, I'll get a bit closer. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I've got a little bit of laryngitis, so it's a little bit harder for me. Sorry, where was I? In that evening, we had cleared around the house. My son and son-in-law were with us. We had a decent meal. And then we have a very, very clear vision of the western aspect of the valley from our house. And we could see the fire up on the mountain. It looked quite sort of, menacing in the dark. And we had seen even the flashing lights of the fire brigade vehicles up behind Cole's house.
And I'll just pause you there, Ms. Dance. I'll just pause you there. Could you see Cole's property from yours?
Yes.
Could you see his other properties, or only the main one?
Only where he normally lived. We could see the house from our house. It was small because it's about 5 k's away as the crow flies, but we could see it.
I think in your evidence, I interrupted you. You said you could see the flashing lights of the RFS. Was that at Cole's property?
Yes, it was. Up behind the house. There's a fire trail behind the house.
From your perspective, where was the fire heading at that time?
It wasn't moving quickly because at that stage there was no wind to speak of. It was very, very, very still on the 30th. I know when we were feeding cattle, it was extremely still, like the leaves weren't even moving in the trees. It was that still and very quiet. And what time,
Miss Dance, what time was that?
That was about lunchtime to about 12-ish on the 30th. We'd come out to feed our cows up on our top farm. Yeah.
And did you stay at your property that night?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you monitor the situation throughout the early hours of the morning?
I monitored. I got the boys to go to bed about 10:30, I said to them, we're going to have a big day tomorrow. And so we all turned in about then. But I didn't sleep well, so I was up and down all night and just checking on the fire. But really the fire had ceased to be looking very dangerous at the western end of the valley, and it was now quite dangerous looking along the southern ridge along what we'd called Spring Mountains. And at about 12 o'clock, it had actually crowned that mountain and was starting to come down the other side.
I'll just pause you there. Pause you there, Ms. Dance. You said at about 4 o'clock, that's 4 a.m. You said the fire crowned. Is that up on the ridge?
No. About 12 o'clock at night. That was when I realised that it was on the top of the mountain.
I see. So 12 o'clock. I'm sorry. I just want to do it in pieces, if that's okay.
Okay.
Ms.
Sure.
Stevens, sorry, Ms. Dance, I'm just interrupting. Just at that 12 o'clock, if we remember where we were at, we're still having a little bit of trouble hearing. I wonder if we could try just with audio only, whether it was better, because when you first started, I think it was a bit clearer.
Okay, so I can
would you mind if we tried that, because it's very important what you're saying, and we want to hear it really clearly.
I'll try to cut it out for you. I'm not sure how to be honest.
There we are. You've done it.
There we go.
If you turn your video off.
Yep, that's it.
Right, thank you, Anna.
So we were talking about 12 o'clock.
We were at midnight. And my next question, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
My next question is, in the early hours of the morning, about 4 or 5 a.m., where was the fire?
Okay, 4 or 5 a.m. we were up. We were all up at that stage. And we were outside, and the fire was on the southern side of the valley on the Spring Mountain. But it was blowing back on itself at about 1 o'clock in the morning. A very, very fierce norwesterly wind started and came through.
And your evidence in your statement, Ms. Dance, is that at about 8 a.m. in the morning, or thereabouts, after the fire went through, you went for a drive. Now, just working backwards from there, was there a point where you and your family realised that you couldn't defend the properties and that you had to get out?
Yes, there was. At around 25 past 7, I realised that I couldn't. I was losing pressure in my hose, and I knew I couldn't put out the fire that was starting around one of the tractors. And then when I turned back to the house, there were small spot fires starting along the western side of the house. I went into the house to get my dogs out. There were embers coming through the shut wooden windows. They're quite sort of loose. It was an older house. And I put wet towels along the windows. My son-in-law came in and called my name and said I needed to get out of the house. The house was going to go.
I'll just pause you there, Ms. Dance. You all got in the car. Did you drive down Ballowra Road to get out?
We drove across the paddocks to the Ballowra Road, and we got to the Ballowra Bridge, which was completely burnt out. So
and can I just to pause you there, at any point in time from when you were packing up to get out and from when you were driving down Ballowra Road, did you see Colin's car?
No.
Did you see Colin at any time during that night?
No.
My next question is that you continued down Ballowra Road. Did you drive to the Ballowra fire shed?
No, we drove to our turn off to our property, and we had signal for the phones, and the boys and myself called immediate family to let them know that we were okay. You know, they called their wives, and I called my sister-in-law to let her know that we were okay. And we drove back to the house and then back through again, realising that the only way we would be able to go and check our other property was to go up through the paddocks and out through a gate that we could get through, which bypassed the bridge, which is what we did. And it was on that, we were back onto the Ballara Road, and we travelled up the Ballara Road to the west. And just before we got to the front gate of our second property, we saw Colin's vehicle burnt out on the side of the road.
So was that around about 8 a.m?
It was probably a little later than that. It was probably about 20 past 8 or 8:30, I'd say.
And did you assess the situation and assess that if Colin was in there, he would not have survived?
I didn't get out of the car. My husband and my son-in-law did. We couldn't see anybody in the car, obviously. And they came back, and I asked my husband, is he there? Can you see him? And he said, he just shook his head. He said he's
Okay.
fine.
Thank you. Armed with that information, did you inform the RFS about what you'd found?
Yes, we did when we got back when we finally got to the fire shed, which was probably another maybe 45 minutes later. We did inform them. They asked us if we'd seen Colin. We said he didn't make it.
And Ms. Dance, just one further question for you. Can you tell the court whether you'd encountered a bushfire like that at any time before the 31st of December?
Never.
Thank you, Your Honour. That's the evidence of this witness.
Thank you. Ms. Dance, if you just wait one moment, we'll just see if there's any other questions for you.
Okay.
Mr. Free.
Your Honour, no questions from us.
Thank you. Mr. Glascott.
Thank you, Your Honour. There are no questions from me.
Ms. Dance, that's the end of your evidence. Thank you very much. I know it's difficult to go through those memories, so I really appreciate you giving evidence today. So you're excused.
Thank you.
Your Honour has the benefit of all the documentary evidence before you and the oral testimony of both of those witnesses. As I said at the outset, Colin's partner, Threlly, she is watching these proceedings and would have been here in court if she was able to. We've spent some time with her and asked whether she'd like to give a family statement. And she doesn't want to do that on the screen, Your Honour, but I will do that on her behalf.
Thank you.
I can say that although she was very reluctant to give evidence, I'll withdraw that, to give a statement, she certainly wanted to provide the court with a number of photographs, and we'll show those.
Thank you. We've got the photos on the screen now.
Thank you, Your Honour. These have been selected by the counsel assisting team, and they reflect what Threlly loved about Colin, and that was that he was a real bush man. She, Your Honour, grew up in the Philippines, but has lived in Australia for about 40 years. She had a long career as a nursing sister, and she met Colin in about 2005 or 6. She lives in Sydney, but explained to us, Your Honour, that the two of them would spend time with each other at either of their properties. As I said at the outset, when she would go and visit him in the bush, she refused to stay at the shack that he normally stayed in and would require them to stay in the main property, which he obliged. That photograph, Your Honour, is from his 70th birthday in the South Coast. When we asked her what she wanted to convey to Your Honour and the court about Colin, she said a number of things, and the main one was about spending time in the bush. She said, I love helping him on the farm, and when I'm there, I do all the weeding for the wattle. They would go camping, and she always had a thermos for him whenever they went. Whenever he would drive back from her property in Sydney, she would pack him a thermos and a snack, and he was always helping people, especially with the RFS. Your Honour, Threlly told us that when she would be with him in Sydney, often he'd get a call from Ewan's wife, Kay. You heard from Ewan earlier, and if Kay told him that there was an RFS meeting, then he would jump in the car and drive back to the South Coast. He also loved running, and he was a member of one of the local running clubs, and it is for those friends that he was driving back at the end of December, he had an annual New Year's Eve party at his property with his running friends, and he didn't want to disappoint them on that year. Your Honour, Threlly says to us that, in her words, I miss Colin every day, all the time. I'm moving on very slowly. Colin is still in my heart and I'm very teary-eyed. She's very grateful, Your Honour, to be able to show these photographs to the court today. And we are very grateful that she's been able to share that of Col. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you, Ms Stevens. And to you, Threlly, I know you're listening, and I would like to express my gratitude to you. It's very obvious how much you loved Col, and I know that the loss of him is immense for you. So I'm grateful for your generosity in sharing your thoughts and memories about Col. Thank you.
Your Honour, as I said earlier, you have the benefit of the documentary material and the evidence, not only of the two witnesses today, but also of Detective Senior Constable Glenn Bradley about the development of the Badger Forest Road fire. At a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into these bushfires, those assisting you will formally address you in regard to the manner and cause of Mr Burns's death. In that regard, I can foreshadow now that a formal submission is likely to be made that Colin Burns died in his vehicle on the morning of the 31st of December 2019 on Ballowra Road, Ballowra, from thermal injuries while driving east from his property during the fire.
Thank you, Ms Stevens.
May it please the court. Your Honour, I'm aware it's earlier than the usual lunch break, but could we take an early lunch and return at 2 o'clock?
Yes, certainly. We'll adjourn now until 2 p.m. Yes, Mr Castledown.
Thank you, Your Honour. Could we move now formally into the inquest into the deaths of Robert Solway and Patrick Solway, Your Honour?
Yes, officially that's what we'll do, is commence those inquests into Robert and Patrick Solway.
My pleasure, Your Honour. This is the inquest into the deaths of Robert and Patrick Solway. Robert and Patrick were father and son and residents of Wandella. Tragically, they both died while in a paddock on their property when the fire reached them on the 31st of December in 2019. Robert was 63 years old and Patrick was 29 years old. The Solway family, Your Honour, are participating in these proceedings, and we take this opportunity to acknowledge the tremendous loss of both Robert and Patrick. The court has received detailed evidence in two separate briefs, which include statements from Janelle Solway, Robert's wife and Patrick's mother, from Aaron Solway, Robert's son and Patrick's brother, and Renee Solway, Patrick's wife and Robert's daughter-in-law, and of course the expert evidence from police in relation to their investigation. This material in its documentary form will ultimately be relied upon by those assisting Your Honour to formally submit on the manner and cause of Robert and Patrick's deaths. I apprehend that later today, Janelle Solway will make a family statement through me, Your Honour. It is important to say something about the Solways. Robert was a fifth-generation dairy farmer in the Wandella area. Robert and Janelle married in 1977 and lived first with Janelle's mother in Cobargo. They soon moved into their own property will go in the Wandella area. In 2011, they purchased and moved to Wingrovia, a farm at 737 Wandella Road. The property is on 220 acres. They held 140 head of cattle and 12 horses at the time of the fires. Robert and Janelle lived in this property as at the date of the fires, a 3-bedroom, double brick farmhouse. Robert and Janelle had 6 children. Patrick was the youngest. He and his wife Renee lived on a self-contained house on the family property and had 1 young child, Harley. Patrick ran his engineering business out of his shed on the property. On the days leading up to the fire, the Sorways prepared for the impending fire. On the 30th of December, Robert and Janelle visited Robert's mother in a nursing home in Bega. They saw a family member who was also a member of the RFS who told them that the fire was getting worse and they should return home and defend their property. Janelle says, Robert and I knew there was a fire in the vicinity of our property to the west. However, we felt we were in a good position to deal with any fires as our property is mostly cleared and was very dry with little grass. We felt we could deal with any spot fires easily. Robert and Janelle arrived home at around 2:30 to 3 p.m. on that day and prepared the property accordingly. They moved cattle, connected hoses and filled tanks with water. Throughout the afternoon and evening, both Robert and Patrick spent hours helping several friends and neighbours prepare their own properties for the impending fire. The investigation by police demonstrates that Patrick was out helping others very late into the night. At about 12:13 a.m, Renee, who was at home, sent Patrick a text message with information that parts of the Snowy Mountains Highway were closed. They had a phone conversation. Patrick told Renee that he was on his way home and that road workers let him through the road blocks. Patrick returned in the early hours of the morning. Once he returned, Renee grew more concerned about the fires. She took baby Harley and drove to Mystery Bay to her mother's house. She left Harley with her mother and returned home to Wandella. Patrick and Renee drove their dogs and horses to Cobargo Showground and returned to the property. At around 3:30 a.m, Renee received a call from her mother at Mystery Bay, telling her that Harley would not settle. The evidence is that Patrick insisted Renee drive back to Mystery Bay to be with the baby and her mother, which she did. It is due to this set of circumstances that Renee was not at the property the following morning when the firestorm hit and when Robert and Patrick passed. At 4 a.m. that morning, Robert, Patrick and Janelle were outside the farmhouse watching the fire. Janelle says it was travelling in an easterly direction and changed direction twice before heading towards their property. She could see embers travelling down and into their paddocks. After that, the family moved their horses to the Cobargo Showground. Patrick got on the tractor ploughing fire breaks and Robert used the quad bike with a water tank to attend to spot fires. Janelle says, we had discussed as a family that we would not try to defend the paddocks, just the dwellings. Robert and Patrick were going to look after one side and I was doing the other. At around 7:30 a.m, Robert and Patrick were working in a paddock about 50 to 80 metres from the western side of the house. It appears that while Robert and Patrick were in the paddock, they became caught in what has been described by Detective Senior Constable Bradley as a ferocious firestorm. The evidence of Janelle Sorway in regard to what happened next is as follows. I then started the motorbike and started to drive around the property. Whilst driving, I could feel the heat from the bushfire. I then driven the motorbike to the machinery shed and work shed area. Whilst driving on the blue metal driveway, I could feel the heat. The heat was so intense and everything went dark. Due to the heat, I just floored it and drove to the machinery shed and work shed area. I could feel the blue metal hitting me. The small stones were very hot and I could feel them burning my skin. I managed to get to the work shed and I saw that the pine trees at the back of the work shed were on fire. I thought I'd better get back to the farmhouse to check on Robert and Patrick and to tell them. I then driven back to the farmhouse and I saw that the front steps to the farmhouse was on fire. I've stopped the bike to put out the fire on the steps. It was very dark and I started to feel for the hose to put the fire out on the stairs. I shouted out, "Robert, where are you?" I heard Robert say, "Patrick, Patrick," in a faint voice. It was still dark, and I thought due to Robert's faint voice that he was talking to Patrick at the garage on the western side of the house. I think I got back on the bike and I was thinking I shouldn't walk around because I could trip due to me needing a walking stick. It started to get a bit lighter, but the smoke was so thick. I rode back around to the back of the house. I was thinking that they were both near the shed on the western side of the farmhouse. When I got closer to the shed, I saw that the roller doors to the shed had been blown out, and the whole eastern side of the shed wall was blown out, was bent around the water tank. I could see that certain objects from the shed were on the ground, some 30 metres away in the paddocks. I thought to myself, where are they? It was still becoming lighter, and I heard Robert say again, "Patrick, Patrick." I was walking back to the farmhouse and I was yelling, "Where are you?" As I turned around the corner of the house and on the northern side down the ramp, I saw a big fire and I saw it was the tractor. I thought Robert and Patrick would be in the farmhouse. Your Honour, after the storm passed, Janelle searched in the house and then back into the paddocks. She located Robert and then Patrick, both deceased in the paddock. She called other family members on the phone and they attended as soon as they could. One of her sons, Aaron, came to the property immediately from his dairy farm in Cobargo. He had been up all night preparing for the fire. In the early morning, he had seen the fire was heading towards his parents' farm. Aaron says, "It was like a bomb going off and I was worried about them." Aaron was putting out spot fires on his own property with his wife and children at the house. His house was saved and the fire moved past it. He had been in contact with his mother shortly before the firestorm hit the Solway property. After Aaron had contained the fire at his own property, he called his mother again. She said, "I've found them, they've gone." Aaron drove to the family farm and helped. He said it looked like a tornado had gone through the place. Aaron took his mother back to his property and they waited for police and emergency services. Your Honour, I now propose to show an aerial photograph of the Solway property with the damage caused by the firestorm, taken by police some days after the event. Your Honour will see to the top of the aerial image green pasture land, and immediately to its right, Your Honour sees the charred and scorched remnants of where the fire has run through, showing the indiscriminate nature of this firestorm. Your Honour also sees the farmhouse as described by Janelle in her evidence, in large part unscathed by this particular firestorm as it's travelled through the Solway property. Your Honour, it's important to pause and to reflect on the circumstances confronting Janelle on that morning. She herself had just survived a firestorm and was then required to run out into the paddock and locate her husband and son, who could not and did not survive it. We recognise the enormity and bravery of her actions and those of Aaron, her other children and her daughter-in-law, Renee. Janelle contacted emergency services, but due to the active fire and obstruction of the access roads, police could not attend until in the afternoon. The police investigation included an analysis undertaken by Detective Senior Sergeant Gregory Moon, who attended the property on the 6th of January 2020. Detective Moon is of the expert opinion that the fire that descended on the Sawway property was the Badger Forest fire. He says the initial fire front moved through the property and a pyrocumulus event followed. Detective Moon examined the location and is of the opinion that this initial fire front damaged a number of paddocks. He considers that Robert and Patrick continued to work to contain the spotting and the damage done by the initial fire front. They likely continued to plough the burnt paddocks and attempt to put out spot fires. In Detective Moon's opinion, there would have been little to no warning of the impending firestorm. Detective Moon has formed the opinion that the pyrocumulus event, otherwise described by some as a firestorm, hit the area at around 7:25 a.m, at which point Robert and Patrick were likely attempting to head back to the property to shelter. Your Honour, the indicators of this pyrocumulus event include the extreme damage to the trees at the location and the surrounding properties, which indicates extreme winds, the destruction of a number of properties to the northwest of the location, which suffered the direct events of the cyclonic winds. This included evidence of the spread of debris, Your Honour, including parts of vehicles moved up to 500 metres from their original positions. And of course, Your Honour, the destruction of the tractor and quad bike. Moreover, Your Honour, the winds in the firestorm uprooted large trees in the immediate area, and limbs from the trees were found strewn over 100 metres from where they once stood. The force of the wind removed the roller doors and the side walls of the colorbond steel shed from its footings. There were a number of photographs taken by investigators of the property that afternoon and in the following days. I propose now, Your Honour, to show some of these photographs, including the fire damage to the property, the location of the paddock, the burnt tractor and quad bike. There are, of course, no images of Robert or Patrick, but, Your Honour, we must pause for a moment to allow any party or person to leave the courtroom while this occurs, if they do not wish to see the images of the extensive damage done by this particular firestorm. Your Honour, this is a photograph of the paddock next to the farmhouse, demonstrating a destroyed gate. In this image, Your Honour sees a fallen tree, one infers from the cyclonic winds adjacent to the family home. Your Honour sees in this photograph an image where the fire has encroached to within metres of the family property. In the bottom right-hand corner, Your Honour sees the charred remains. In this photograph, Your Honour sees the damage sustained to the shed as the firestorm has rolled through that area of the property. Your Honour, this is the tractor which was used by Robert in the paddock. Your Honour sees again in this photograph the indiscriminate nature of this particular firestorm, where we have unburnt pasture land to the left-hand side of the image. Your Honour, this is the quad bike which was used by Patrick in the paddock. The final image is a high aerial photograph of the family property and the fire damage to the paddocks and surrounds. Again, showing the indiscriminate nature of this particular firestorm. Your Honour, it is important to acknowledge the evidence of Aaron Sorway when he said in his statement, "I don't think Dad or Patrick would have risked their lives to stay if they knew what was coming their way. I believe that they thought they would be able to stay and protect the property. The fire was so swift and severe that they could not know what was happening till the fire hit them." The same sentiment, Your Honour, was conveyed by Janelle, who told investigating police, "I think we prepared well for a normal fire. We have dealt with them before, and each year we reduced hazards around the property. I don't think anyone could have been prepared for what impacted upon our property that morning." Your Honour, that concludes my opening remarks in relation to these two inquests. If it's convenient to Your Honour, I now propose to call Mr. Peter Anderson to give some evidence.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Anderson, can you see and hear us yet?
Yes.
All right. We'll just get the court officer to speak to you now.
Okay.
Thank you. We can see you.
Okay, there you go. All right, I'll leave. Okay.
All right, I'm going to go out now and I'll come back when Mr. Anderson's finished.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Anderson, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
I'll take the oath.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Sir, would you please state your full name?
Peter John Anderson.
And do you presently reside at a property on Yowie Road, Yowie?
Yes, 68 Yarry Road.
And have you, Mr. Anderson, provided a statement in relation to the matters before Her Honour?
Yes.
Date 13th of May 2020.
Yes, I have done that, yes.
And do you have a copy? Do you have a copy, sir, of your statement with you this afternoon?
Yes, I do.
Were you a neighbour of Robert and Janelle Sorway?
Yes, I am a neighbour about 800 metres away from their homestead, sort of. I boundary onto their property.
And as the crow flies, how far is your home from theirs?
It might be 700-800 metres maximum.
And I'll just bring up to assist Her Honour understand better where your property is positioned. Do you see there an aerial photograph, and it's been marked with the number 1 and the number 2?
Yes.
Is your property marked number 2?
That is correct, yes.
And is the Sorway property marked number 1?
Yes.
And does your just so in terms of orientation, does your property sit on the western boundary of the Sorway's property?
More
not?
southern.
More southern.
Yes.
Thank you. And as you said a moment ago, in terms of distance between your house and the Sorway house, it might be 700 to 800 metres as the crow flies.
That is correct, yes.
And Robert and Janelle Sorway were well known to you, were they not?
They were. I spent a lot of time with them over the years. Yes.
And indeed, you all attended the same school in the local area.
That is correct, yes.
I just want to come now, if I may, Mr. Anderson, to the days leading up to the fire that impacted the Wandella area. When did you first become aware that there was a fire that had commenced in the Badger State Forest?
Would have been, I think it might have been 2 or 3 days prior, because you could see it of an afternoon, the glow from my place to the west, where it came through out of Counterguinea towards the back of Yarrie, and that's where it comes through.
And to assist those who aren't particularly familiar with that part of New South Wales, how far is Wandella from Counterguinea?
Counterguinea or Kybian, as the crow flies, it may be 10, 20 miles sort of thing.
Thank you. Now, did you become aware of a fire to the west of your property, that is a fire within the Badger State Forest, through what you observed, or was there word of mouth, or had there been alerts sent to you, or were you watching the fires near Meap? How did you become aware of it initially?
Initially, I seen the flames. I could see the fireball of an afternoon, and talking to a companion of mine, one of his mates, or my friends, were on one of the bulldozers that were trying to put fire breaks in on top of the mountain around the Counterguinea area, and which was unsuccessful. And he rang up and said, "It's uncontrolled, we can't stop it, and it's on its way towards you people."
And doing the best you can today, how many days was that before that tragic day where Robert and Patrick Sorway died?
I don't want to guess or anything, but it would have been a couple of days. You lose it a little bit, but I think it would have been 2 to 3 days. You could see it brewing up, ready, coming our way.
In circumstances where you've heard that it's likely to be coming your way, what did you decide to do in terms of either staying or leaving? And if staying, what was your plan going to be?
My plan was to stay. I had lots of water. I've got lots of tanks at home and generators, and that was my decision, to stay and battle it out, which I did. I had it nice and clean around my house and sheds, and stay to protect the animals and my house.
You mentioned you had a number of tanks. What was your main water source at that point in time, Mr. Anderson? I had my son-in-law and his father with a truck with 2 1,000 drums on the back with a new firefighting system. I had my own tractor with 1,000 litres on it, and another little tanker behind a 4-wheel drive that we were filling up out of cattle troughs and tanks from my house. Thank you. And at this point in time, this is late December 2019, had you, prior to that time, ever been involved in the protection of your property or not from fire?
No, that was the first time ever there that I had.
Had you seen before this time bushfire in the area or not?
I've seen a lot of big grass fires over the years. When I was at primary school, we got burnt out at a place called Cooligalite near Bermagui. And I was only a young fella, and we got burnt right out there years ago. And I can remember that.
Now,
yeah.
If I could take you, please, into paragraph 11 of your statement. I just want to clarify with you whether you may have incorrectly recorded the date or dates in your statement. In paragraph 11, you refer to the evening of Saturday, the 31st of December. Just to help orientate you, Robert and Patrick died in the early morning around 7:30 or thereabouts on the 31st of December.
Yeah.
Could you mean in the second sentence of paragraph 11 that it was the 30th of December?
On the evening of the 31st. Yeah, it was the 31st, the day of the fire, wasn't it? Yeah, well, that was, yeah, then the early hours of the morning. Yeah, well, it was the 30th leading into the 31st, wasn't it? That the fire hit us at 4:45 in the morning.
Thank you. That correction has been noted. What were you expecting? You've indicated in your evidence now and in your written statement that you were prepared for the fire to protect property. What, in your mind, were you expecting to be confronted by, having not previously experienced a bushfire in and around your home?
I knew there was going to be a fire, but when it was coming through the bush, I and several other people that I had there around at the time thought maybe when it enters out of the bushline into our clear country at the where it's open country, it would slow down and be able to be managed. But that was not the case, mate. That was not the case.
And I'll return to that in a moment, if I may, Mr. Anderson. But leading up to the evening of the 30th of December, do you recall what the prevailing weather conditions were like, or not?
Yeah, it was. It wasn't as windy, or it wasn't blowing like it did when the fire produced its own strength, but it wasn't that serious, like windy or anything like that. It was calm conditions, sort of.
Was there any wind at all, to your recollection, or not, in that time, late in the evening on the 30th?
No, I don't think it was blowing anything like, no. There could have been a small breeze, but nothing like it was when it did front up.
No. Bearing in mind that it was night time, again, on the evening of the 30th of December, do you recall what the temperature was like, or not?
It was warm, mate. I forget what exactly the temperature was, but it was very warm, yes.
And that same evening on the 30th of December, could you see a red glow to the west of your property, which may have been the fire front heading your way, or not?
Oh, for sure, because I sat on the hill at the back of the house, and that's where we could see, we had a clear view of it, roaring like a raging bull in the big glow out the back, sort of, yeah.
And you could hear it roaring, I take it, clearly?
Clearly, mate, clearing like a roaring bull coming out of the mountains.
And does your house sit in a valley, or is it on high ground? How would you describe the topography of where your property is?
Where I built, it would be the highest point around the area there, with a couple of other hills there. It's built up fairly well on top of a hill with a big windbreak out of earth built around the back of it, cut into the hill. And
did you stay up that night and into the early hours of the 31st of December, Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, I sat on the veranda with the other 3 people that I had there to help me, sat there watching, listening and waiting.
And were those 3 people you've referred to Glenn Morrison, Bradley Monckton and Ted Monckton?
That is correct.
Was there a shift in the weather at any time before daylight, to your recollection, or not?
Not really, not in the stance that it was something major in those times and before the fire. No, something was happening, was brewing, but it wasn't horrific or anything at that time.
And that glow you've described and that roar that you described a moment ago, did the glow become brighter and the roar of the fire become louder throughout the course of the evening and early hours of the 31st of December?
It did. It got hotter, and once it started coming towards, you could see it, and then it turned at Yarry and headed around towards Quorma, along back into Quorma, and then it come towards us.
And when it was coming towards you, what direction was it coming from, doing the best you can today?
From the west to start with, and then yes.
Did it maintain a westerly path, or did it diverge at any point?
It diverted as when the ambers and all the spot fires started. Weather conditions changed dramatically from west. It come from the south. It come from different directions. At that time, it did, yes.
And was that at about 4:45 in the morning, where there was that change and there started to be spotting occurring?
That was it. It was 4:45, and when it hit, ambers hit where we were watching from the hill. Another neighbour to the west hit down his driveway, and then that started from there, just dropping little bombs everywhere.
And at this point in time, what were you and Messrs Morrison and Mockton doing? Were you manning hoses, or what were you doing?
Well, at 4:45, it started probably 10 minutes after that initial strike over the neighbours, and I was running around on a four-wheel motorbike with a big spray unit, putting out spot fires, and Mr Monkton and Bradley tried to do the same thing across the road, and it just, to no avail, it defeated us. So we headed back to the house and protected it up there.
You described in your statement that the conditions prior to the spot fire were horrendous. You've said the temperature was between 30 and 40 degrees and the wind was blowing 30 to 40 knots from the west. Does that sound about right today?
That's correct. That is, it was very, very hot, unbelievably, for that time of the morning.
And this is at a time before sunrise, I take it?
That is correct, yes.
Had you ever, prior to this moment in time, experienced temperatures like that before in the early hours of the morning?
No, not really. No, never before. It was just a one-off monster that was happening at the time.
You've mentioned that the spot fires were igniting upon your property. What was happening in relation to the head of the fire, the fire front? Did you have a sense of where it was whilst the embers are coming down and spot fires are occurring?
Never had any idea where the initial part of the fire were, because the spot fires were just bombing everywhere, and they sort of come together, sort of thing, as one unit. Then it come through, as I said, from the south, jumped up over the road from the south then, and that's when it had waves, had walls of fire like 1.5 meters, 2 metres sort of high, and just rolling through the paddock towards my hay shed and towards the Solways down towards their place.
And take a moment if you need to, please, Mr Anderson, but you've just described a wave of fire going down towards the Solway property. Do you know about what time of the day that may have been?
Well, yeah, it would have been 5:30, 5:15 in the morning, sort of thing. It wouldn't have been about half an hour to 3/4 of an hour after the main spot fire started, and yeah, about, I'd say 3/4 of an hour, so it sort of started rolling through.
You've described that sequence of events in your statement in these terms. Once these fires commenced, the conditions became at their worst and the fires developed into a firestorm. The fire was creating its own weather system, and before I knew it, the wind changed direction and commenced swirling and blowing from the south.
Yeah, correct.
The fires which were burning were travelling at an extreme speed and burning paddocks which had very little fuel in them.
Mm-hmm.
The fire was 2 metres in height and rolling like a wave in the ocean. Now, that accords with what you've just said a moment ago in your oral evidence. Can I ask you this, Mr. Anderson? Where were you when that was occurring?
I was down the paddock trying to save my hay shed and cattle at the time, and putting out spot fires, and one spot fire burned a big enough area that I drove my cattle onto, and they stood in that area, and then I evacuated back up to the house. I had to get close to a big tree so I didn't get burnt on my 4-wheel motorbike, and go through a bit of a flame to get out of it, back over burnt ground back to the house.
And did you remain at the house until the fire had passed through?
Yes, totally, until it was, well, it was never over, but I stayed there because it kept blowing up and starting in different places, burnt ground again at the back of my house, and we had to contend with that at all times.
Were you able to protect the house?
We did, yes, we did.
You also say in your statement, Mr. Anderson, I couldn't believe it when I saw it, and I've seen nothing like it in my lifetime, and I hope that I never see anything like it again. The fire was brutal and held no enemies. It was like the fire was just taking hold of everything and burning it in its path. There were trees which had computed before the fire had even reached it. There were limbs which were attached to huge red gum and box trees which had been strewn from its trunk. The power of this fire was something which is hard to explain. When the head of this fire impacted upon me and my property, I believe it was only because I and the others had so much water on the ground that my property was saved. The firestorm I spoke about intensified on one occasion, and I believe I was on the edge of the storm when it passed through.
Correct.
Robert and Patrick must have been in direct line of the firestorm.
Yeah, that is correct, yeah. To my place, towards Patrick and Robert's place is the strip down into the bottom of Wandella where it tore the tops out of trees. I was on the edge of it, I feel. It ripped the trees apart and smashed them for miles in a strip through their place.
You say towards the end of your statement, Mr. Anderson, about an hour or two prior to the fire impacting, the RFS drove up and down Yowie Road, speaking on a loudspeaker telling us to evacuate. Now, just pausing there, do you know what time of the day that may have been when you were warned by RFS to evacuate?
It was about when the ambers were lighting at the start of the fire. When it started, they were on the road. They went up past my driveway with loud hailers, singing out to get out or whatever. And I do think it would have been about the 4:45 or 5 o'clock.
Before the spotting had occurred, and certainly before the main fire front was upon your property?
Yes, because when they went up, there was a couple of fire trucks because a house got burnt down on the hill way before all this really started getting its act together. We could see a house burning on County Bounty Road, and fire brigade were there. Then they left after they couldn't do nothing.
Can I ask you this, Mr. Anderson? Why didn't you take notice of the RFS warning to evacuate? Why did you decide to stay?
I built my house, and I had my feelings that I could protect because I had ample water and I did have assistance. If I was there by myself, I would not have been able to do it. I probably wouldn't have stayed.
Reflecting upon the events that occurred on the 31st of December 2019, if you had your time again, would you have made the same decision to stay, or would you have taken the advice of the RFS and evacuated?
No, I would have stayed because I had good gear and I had lots of water.
Notwithstanding that what you were confronted with on that day was a firestorm that you had never seen anything like in your lifetime before?
Yeah, well, I didn't know it was going to be so severe, mate, but it,
If you knew now, if you knew what you know now back then, would you have decided to stay or not?
I think I would. I've got things in my house that I didn't want to ever see it disappear. As in hand stuff down from grandfathers and families' coin collections, and I didn't want to lose. And a new house, not a 10 or 12-year-old house, I didn't want to. That was why I done what I done.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Anderson. There may be some further questions by other parties.
Just one moment, Mr. Anderson. I'll just ask. First of all, Mr. Free, do you have any questions?
No, Your Honour, thank you.
And Mr. Glascott?
Your Honour, thank you.
Mr. Anderson, thank you so much for giving evidence today. I know it can't have been easy, and I really appreciate it. You're excused now. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Your Honour, that concludes the evidence at this stage in relation to the two inquests into the deaths of Robert and Patrick Sorway. If it's convenient, Your Honour, I'd like to read a family statement on behalf of Janelle Sorway in relation to her husband Robert.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. Robert was a fifth-generation dairy farmer whose family farmed in the Cobargo area. He loved the land and was content with his chosen life. He was a devoted father to 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, who also inherited the love of the land. In his later years, after the boys took over the dairy farm, he bought himself a beef farm, where in 2018 he started Wingrove Limousin Stud. Retirement was not on his agenda. He loved to get outside and work his land. Working with cattle was his passion. Robert was a simple-lived man. He was most content sitting having a cuppa on the veranda overlooking his much-loved farm. He never felt the need to travel, but he was very community-minded, serving almost 50 years as a committee member of the Cobargo Show Society. People often said he had the eye for good cattle, be it dairy or beef, and was often asked to judge at shows up and down the coast. He often was heard saying his greatest achievements in life were his children and doted over his grandchildren. He loved watching them play sport, ride and swim, and his favourite day of the year was Christmas Day, when all our family came together. There was always so much fun and laughter. Robert enjoyed nearly 43 years of marriage with Janelle, and everything was done together in that time. Robert's death has left the family and community numb as we all learn to soldier on without him. Every day is hard. He learnt us all to face each day with strength and stay strong, because there is nothing more resilient than a united family.
I'd just like to speak directly to Janelle and Renee and Aaron and the whole Solway family and express my gratitude for sharing those beautiful words. I appreciate this must be incredibly difficult and painful to hear the evidence today about that terrible day that happened on the 31st of December. And just, I hope you know that you're very much in our thoughts today. Thank you.
Your Honour, there are two further family statements, if I may. These relate to Patrick Solway. The first is from his mother, Janelle, and the second from his wife, Renee.
Thank you.
Patrick was born on the 9th of January 1990. He was a very lovable child and had 5 older doting brothers and sisters. He was a super happy child and later in life a wonderful young man. He had a very caring nature and would help anyone who needed help. Patrick was a talented engineer and also a dairy technician, and the two qualifications moulded together made his business very lucrative. He had a wonderful work ethic and most days worked 18-hour days, making the time he got to spend with his wife Renee and son Harley very special. He was a talented young man who loved his horses, bull riding, football, fishing and cross-country motorbike riding. Anything he put his mind to, he would do. Patrick won the prestigious award of being the Grand National Champion Rider of the Year for 2 years in a row on 2 different horses, which was something that I will never forget. Anyone who met Patrick instantly became a friend. He also was community-minded and worked tirelessly for the Cobargo Show Society. His death has left an empty space in his family's lives and none more than his beautiful son Harley, who now has no father. I come now, Your Honour, to Renee's family statement. Patrick James Solway, the baby of the family, the joy and humour, the brightest light. He completed Robert and Janelle's family and made it whole. A dedicated hard worker who lived fully for all those he loved. I think the depth of a loss deepens with what they gave out to the world. How many hearts they touched, the good they did. Patrick gave so much to our lives. Meeting him when I was 15, both of us starting and completing our apprenticeships, later on establishing our own company and often travelling around competing together with our much-loved show horses. Now leaving behind our little boy who we adored and our life we had created together. Life was beautiful, life was simple, we were happy. And I'll just have my instructing solicitor show some family photographs.
Thank you.
And I'm told Harley on the left and Charlie on the right.
Ah, lovely.
Your Honour, that concludes the family statements.
Thank you. And I'm very moved to see those photos of Robert and Patrick. It's just striking what an incredible loss it is to your big, lovely family, but also to the whole community, because they obviously were people that loved and gave so much. So thank you.
Your Honour now has the benefit of the documentary material contained within Exhibits 6 and 7, together with the oral testimony from Detective Senior Constable Glenn Bradley, which Your Honour received yesterday, and of course Peter Anderson today. Your Honour has also had the benefit of hearing the words of Janelle Sorway, Robert's wife and Patrick's mother, and Renee Sorway, Patrick's wife, by way of family statements. At a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, those assisting Your Honour will formally address Your Honour on the manner and cause of Robert and Patrick's death. In that regard, I can foreshadow now to Your Honour and to my learned friends that a formal submission is likely to be made that Robert Sorway died in the morning of the 31st of December 2019 at 787 Wandella Road, Wandella, from thermal injuries while attempting to protect his property during a fire known as the Badger Forest Fire. I can also foreshadow to Your Honour now and to my learned friends that a formal submission is likely to be made that Patrick Sorway died in the morning of the 31st of December 2019 at 787 Wandella Road, Wandella, from thermal injuries while attempting to protect his family's property during a fire known as the Badger Forest Fire. Your Honour, one final matter of procedure, if I may. Could I request that Your Honour stand over these two inquests generally to stage 2 of Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, which is fixed to commence on Monday the 5th of September 2022.
Yes, I do that now.
And if I may, if you could make the same order in relation to the inquest into the death of Colin Burns.
I do that for the inquest into the death of Colin Burns as well. It's also stood over.
May it please the Court. In terms of the order of proceedings for tomorrow, for the benefit of Your Honour and my learned friends, tomorrow morning, my learned junior, Ms Stevens, will open the inquest into the death of Michael Clark. Following that, evidence will be called from Mr Robert Eder. Your Honour, my instructing solicitor is still confirming with the Clark family about their participation. At the conclusion of that inquest, I will open the inquest into the death of Ross Rickson. And Your Honour, Mr Neil, a neighbour of Mr Rickson's, will be called to give evidence. And that should close out the proceedings for tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr Castleton.
May it please the Court.
We'll adjourn now until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Please, I'll stand as Coroners